Several members have also said that we could rely on other sources of revenues other than taxes. For instance, Mr. Louis Chua cited that the government's total estimated receipts and claimed that the government has far more surpluses than we do for spending. Now, he must know that includes our capital receipts from land sales. He's really saying that we should spend our land sales proceeds directly. And Mr. Louis Chua also cited the increase in NIRC in 2021 as one of the reasons we should not be, and I quote, overzealous in strengthening our revenue position. We should treat our land as a scarce and finite asset. Selling land does not give the government more resources and should not directly support our expenditure. Instead, we sell the land that we need to sell for urban developments and invest the proceeds. This approach generates a sustainable stream of income over the long term and has served us well. If we had decided in the past to spend the proceeds from these land sales, we would not have built up our reserves today and would surely be worse off by now. Relying directly on land sale for fiscal revenue also has two risks. First, land prices can be volatile. You do not want government revenues to fluctuate wildly with property cycles because it creates too much uncertainty for the government to plan long term. Second, even more serious, once the government gets used to relying on land sales to fund spending, the government has a vested interest to keep land prices high or to sell more land. Both options are terrible. And we can see the distortionary effects on the welfare of people in places where local governments rely on land sales for revenue. The current approach of spending the land sales proceeds through the NIRC avoids these pitfalls and allows the government to make land sales decisions based on what is best for the country's development and not because it needs to balance the budget.
Just two clarifications, Mr. Speaker. I think the first is basically one where I raised that the government cash surplus from 2011 to 2019, that's about 261 billion, about 29 billion of cash surplus a year. Now, I understand that DPM mentioned that the land sales revenue would form a key part of it. Based on what I could see, that would be about 138 billion within the same time period, or about 15 billion. So in the spirit of accountability, just so all of us can better understand, where did the balance 14 billion of cash surplus come from? And I understand the need for us to be prudent about the use of land sales, and this is something which I understand, but I think it's not one where we're calling for the use of land sales revenue in its entirety. It is one whereby if you look at the incentives to using land sales revenue, they already exist today, but probably in a different extent. The incentives for using land sales as a means to increase revenue, I think that's something that's already done indirectly, and so that is already in place, although to a different extent. But I think the broader point I also like to share is that I think in the context of Singapore, I think when it comes to land sales, it is something which I believe is a recurring source of revenue for the government as well. I think that's the first clarification. I think the second is, I think, there's been a lot of talk about our reserves, and I think just now DPM mentioned that it's about 20 years of surplus. Yesterday, a different member shared that we have blown about 10 years worth of savings. And I think earlier today, a separate member also shared that, how long do we need before we can replenish our reserves? So probably it will be helpful for members of this House to understand, after accounting for the additional 11 billion of the draw at the end of FY 2021, where would our reserves be? I mean, we do not need to know absolute number, but where would our reserves be compared to 10 years ago, 5 years ago? And I think that also helps us to understand the context without knowing the absolute amount of the reserves itself.
Land sales, that there is an incentive for the government to use land sales because the revenues are already done indirectly. That is wrong. I said very clearly that when we do land sales, it is to meet the needs for our people, for our economy. You cannot plan land sales on the basis that we need the revenue, therefore I would have to do that. And once the land sales proceeds, it goes into the past reserves, right? Now, so I totally reject your allegation that the government has an incentive to sell more land in order to generate revenue. If the government had an incentive, I would not have pointed out the problems in many countries. And I've studied this in many countries, where unfortunately, when the government, especially the local government, is so reliant on land sales, that they have a vested interest to keep land prices high because they needed the revenue, and in turn that creates a lot of hardship for people. So our system cannot incentivize. And the URA has long-term plans, 50-year plans, 20-year plans. So the land use planning has been a great strength of Singapore. So I think you should seriously look at what the agencies have been doing, and do not make allegations like this, because I think it will demoralize the many good officers that we have in our planning department, URA, in making sure in our Ministry of National Development that have over the years allowed for so much development in so compact a land. And by the way, one of the areas that I'm hoping that we can do more in our research plan is precisely on urban solutions and sustainability, something which SMTO started when he was chairman of NRF and which we are continuing. Because that is a constraint for Singapore, and if we can overcome this constraint, we can do better.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. I would just like to share that I did not make the allegation that, so basically what I was trying to basically get at is that if we look at the context of Singapore, the land sales revenue, I think that is a recurrent source of revenue for the government over a period of time. I am actually not belittling the work of our Ministry of National Development and the good officers of the URA. I think that is something that they have done well in terms of the concept plan, master plan. I think what we are looking at is in terms of the level of cash surplus that the government is generating, understanding where this comes from, because I think on the technical point as well, if the NRIC, that is something that is to be used, then that should not actually form part of the cash surplus if it has already been used.
Made the point in a very indirect way to say that, well, government is doing it indirectly, and I'm glad that you are taking it back to say that this is not, that you are not making that. So I thank you for that clarification. But let me repeat that when land sales does not, government has no incentive to sell land for the purpose of generating revenue. Right? Our reserve protection framework has safeguarded all the assets that we have. You're just converting one asset to another form of asset, and these are guarded.
Mr. Darrow David. 31st March 2022. As many as are of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. We have completed the debate on the budget statement. We're now going into the Committee of Supply to debate estimates. I've revised the commencement time of the Committee of Supply to start immediately.